On October 17, 2010, a man was found dead under mysterious circumstances inside room 406 of the Hotel Mirador in Marbella, Spain. That man was Fakhar Al-Basti, a senior Hamas commander, whose sudden death would unravel an international story of espionage, betrayal, and lethal precision. The room smelled faintly of cologne and disinfectant, but behind the locked door lay a tableau that suggested both routine and rupture. His suitcase was half-packed, his wallet neatly placed on the nightstand, and his phone screen frozen on an unread message. The chambermaid who discovered him expected nothing more than another hungover tourist, yet what she saw instead was a lifeless body draped across a white linen bed, face slack, eyes half open, and skin already cooling. Within minutes, hotel security cordoned off the corridor, their radios crackling with urgent Spanish, while whispers began to spread among guests sipping espresso in the lobby. Something about the scene was off. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken glass, no struggle. Only silence and the eerie impression that someone had been there and left without leaving a trace. Local police arrived quickly, attempting to secure what appeared at first glance to be a natural death. A heart attack, perhaps, but officers soon noticed details that refused to cooperate with such simplicity. A faint puncture mark on the side of his neck, an oddly displaced pillow, a digital keycard log that did not align with his check-in records. Questions multiplied like shadows in the dim hallway. If this was no accident, then who had dared to strike here, in a tourist city brimming with surveillance cameras, gossip, and European law? The discovery rippled outward almost instantly. Spanish intelligence officers received encrypted calls warning them to tread carefully. Foreign press speculated on whether Marbella had just become the latest theater for Middle Eastern score settling. The word assassination was not yet spoken aloud, but it hung in the air, unspoken yet undeniable, waiting to be confirmed. By nightfall, whispers hardened into certainty. Fakhar Al-Basti had not died by chance. His identity transformed the story from a local police file into an international crisis. He was no mere traveler, but a commander with bloodlines to secret networks stretching from Gaza to Damascus. His presence in Spain was itself a riddle. Why was he here, away from the battlegrounds, cloaked in anonymity under a false passport? The mere fact that he had been hunted and found on European soil sent shivers through diplomatic corridors. Spain, a nation accustomed to balancing relationships with both Israel and Arab states, suddenly found itself unwilling host to an invisible war. If Al-Basti was indeed targeted, then a foreign intelligence agency had operated with surgical precision in Marbella, violating sovereignty, mocking borders, and delivering a chilling message. Nothing was beyond reach. The elegance of the setting only deepened the menace. A hotel poolside where families splashed, a seaside boulevard filled with laughter, and above it all, an assassin moving silently, leaving only the echo of absence. Global stakes emerged immediately. For Hamas, the death of a seasoned commander represented not only a personal loss, but a breach of security so profound it threatened their entire operational structure abroad. For Israel, if implicated, the assassination would underline their doctrine of preemptive neutralization, reminding enemies that nowhere was safe. And for Europe, the question loomed. Was Marbella just another sunlit postcard, or had it become the latest chessboard in the shadow war between militants and spies? Who knew of Fakhar Al-Basti's journey to Spain, and who had the reach to orchestrate his death so flawlessly? Was this the hand of Mossad, pursuing its doctrine of long memory and longer vengeance, or a rival faction silencing its own? Could local collaborators have played a role, lured by money, ideology, or the cold calculus of survival? Each possibility peeled open a darker layer of the story, a reminder that in espionage, trust is always provisional, loyalty always conditional. Why strike at this moment, in a hotel tucked among tourists, rather than on the battlefield of Gaza? Was this a message meant not only for Hamas, but for every adversary watching? The type of message written in silence and confirmed by a body in a bed? Did the operative slip away unnoticed, already boarding flights under new names while investigators stumbled through misleading trails? Or was someone still watching from nearby, savoring the confusion that followed? And in the end, the question that towered above all others lingered. Was this death an isolated act of vengeance, or part of a much broader campaign? A campaign waged in shadows, across continents, where the rules of war vanish and only power decides. Fakhar Al-Basti was born in 1968 in the Shati refugee camp, perched on Gaza's battered coastline, where overcrowded alleys hummed with hardship. His father, a fisherman who had lost his boat during the upheavals of the late 1960s, struggled to feed the family, while his mother held together the fragile household with resilience born of necessity. Fakhar was the second of 6 children, a boy raised not with toys or textbooks, but with stories of dispossession told in whispers beside flickering kerosene lamps. The environment imprinted upon him early, the sense that life was already a battlefield, one that required both endurance and cunning. As a child, Fakhar showed unusual patience, lingering in corners of the camp to observe before acting, unlike other boys who burst into play with reckless abandon. Teachers at the UNRWA school noted that his handwriting was meticulous, his answers deliberate, and his gaze unflinching. But alongside this studious exterior, he carried an anger sharpened by poverty. He watched neighbors queue for flour rations, listened as elders spoke of villages lost to the tide of conflict, and witnessed his father's silent humiliation whenever soldiers searched their home without cause. These experiences did not merely wound him. They forged within him a worldview that life was defined by power, who had it and who did not. By adolescence, Fakhar had grown lean and restless, spending hours at the shoreline where the sea breeze mixed with the scent of diesel and decay. Friends recalled how he collected fragments of metal and wood, fashioning crude toys or contraptions, a hobby that revealed both ingenuity and obsession with control over his environment. Yet even in these youthful pursuits there was an edge. He often spoke of outlasting hardship, of someday standing taller than those who imposed it. Such declarations were not mere bravado. They were vows whispered into salt air. His teenage years coincided with growing unrest across Gaza, where protests and clashes became an almost daily soundtrack. Fakhar joined demonstrations as a boy with more determination than fear, often at the front, slinging stones with calculated precision. The security forces responded with batons and tear gas, and though he bore bruises home, his mother noticed he returned with eyes brighter, not dimmed. The child who once lingered quietly in alleys was morphing into a young man convinced that action, not endurance, defined survival. These early years formed the bedrock of the man who would later draw the attention of intelligence agencies across continents. By his early 20s, Fakhar al-Basti's worldview had crystallized into a rigid framework defined by resistance, discipline, and secrecy. He immersed himself in Islamic texts, not with the casual piety of neighbors, but with the intensity of someone searching for a grand architecture of meaning. The verses he quoted in conversation were carefully chosen, almost weaponized, to anchor his conviction that endurance and sacrifice were divine mandates. Friends remembered that while others debated politics casually, Fakhar spoke in absolutes, as if every dialogue was another battle to be won with words before bullets. His ideology fused religion with resistance, and from this mixture emerged the blueprint for the life he would pursue. Yet he was far from a zealot in appearance. Fakhar was meticulous in his habits. He shaved with precision, pressed his shirts carefully, and carried notebooks filled not only with tactical sketches, but with lists of proverbs and personal reflections. He was known to eat sparingly, preferring olives, bread, and tea, often declining heavier meals even when food was available. His colleagues joked that he could live for days on discipline alone, an ascetic in the body of a strategist. Oddly enough, he also had a fondness for puzzles, spending hours arranging and rearranging wooden pieces into patterns, a pastime that echoed the patience and calculation of his future operations. Despite his stern exterior, Fakhar carried quirks that unsettled and intrigued those around him. He detested lateness, once scolding a comrade for arriving 3 minutes late to a meeting. He also believed strongly in symbolic gestures. He carried a small stone from the ruins of his ancestral village, wrapped in cloth, keeping it close even when traveling abroad. These habits, seemingly minor, painted the portrait of a man who required order in a disordered world, whose personal life mirrored the ideological rigidity that would come to define his militant career. Over time, Fakhar al-Basti collected nicknames that reflected both fear and admiration. Within his circle he was called al-Sahem, meaning the arrow, a reference to his sharp focus and ability to strike quickly before vanishing. Rivals and informants whispered a different name, the Gray Man, because of his uncanny ability to blend into any crowd, to pass unnoticed through borders, markets, and even airports where others would falter. Both nicknames captured elements of a persona he cultivated deliberately. Fakhar did not see himself as a soldier in uniform, but as an instrument of destiny, moving unseen, decisive, and precise. He often reinforced this image through stories, sometimes exaggerating small acts of stealth or cleverness, until they resembled parables. To young recruits, he portrayed himself as a guardian of continuity, a man destined to ensure that the struggle did not flicker out. To close allies, he confessed that anonymity was his greatest weapon. He would say, "The one who is unseen lives the longest." This dual identity, legend to some, shadow to others, was no accident. Fakhar shaped his self-image with careful intent, believing that perception itself was a tool of war, as vital as any weapon hidden beneath the sand. The transition from restless youth to militant was less a sudden leap and more a steady march, each step marked by circumstance and conviction. By the late 1980s, Gaza was ablaze with the First Intifada, and Fakhar Al-Basti found himself swept into its rhythm. What began as street protests, chants, and stones evolved into organized resistance, and he gravitated toward figures who spoke not only of rebellion, but of structured strategy. His natural discipline, honed through years of meticulous habit, made him an asset in meetings where secrecy and planning outweighed passion alone. At first, Fakhar played supportive roles: courier, lookout, organizer of supplies. Yet his patience and ability to memorize entire routes and codes without writing them down distinguished him. Senior militants began to trust him with delicate assignments, transporting messages across checkpoints, disguising shipments within ordinary goods, and securing safe houses in the labyrinth of Gaza's alleys. He proved himself not only reliable, but imaginative, improvising solutions when plans unraveled. Each success deepened his sense that he was chosen for something larger, a vessel for struggle that demanded total devotion. Politics entered his life almost as camouflage. He attended community meetings, engaged with local clerics, and positioned himself as a voice of principled defiance. While many militants operated in shadows alone, Fakhar recognized the utility of appearing as a legitimate political figure. He began writing articles under pseudonyms, speaking of resistance not merely as violence but as a moral duty. In this dual life, he discovered balance. The politician's pen softened the militant's rifle, each role shielding the other from exposure. By the early 1990s, Fakhar Al-Basti was no longer just a boy from Shati camp. He was a man stepping fully into the world of clandestine warfare and public defiance, a figure destined to attract attention far beyond Gaza's borders. The story of Fakhar Al-Basti cannot be told without first entering the long shadow of the Arab-Israeli conflict, a conflict that shaped every choice he made and every target that eventually sought him. By the late 20th century, the Gaza Strip had become a crucible of despair and defiance, its streets echoing with the footsteps of children born into occupation and resistance. The broader conflict was not a single war, but a relentless cycle of clashes, ceasefires, negotiations, and betrayals. Each generation inherited both the memory of past battles and the inevitability of future ones. The wars of 1948 and 1967 redrew the map, scattering hundreds of thousands into refugee camps like Shati, where Fakhar was raised. These were not merely places of shelter, but incubators of resentment, where the language of exile intertwined with daily survival. The 1973 war reopened wounds and reaffirmed that peace was elusive, always dangled, never delivered. In this environment, militancy was not presented as an aberration, but as a continuum, a natural response to decades of dislocation and military domination. For young men like Fakhar, the choice appeared less ideological than existential: resist or be erased. The rise of Hamas in 1987 during the First Intifada introduced a new dynamic into this already turbulent equation. Unlike the secular nationalism of the Palestine Liberation Organization, Hamas fused Islamist ideology with militant action, offering both spiritual certainty and tactical resistance. Fakhar's generation gravitated toward it because it promised not only to fight, but to endure, to weave identity and faith into a banner that could not be compromised at negotiation tables. By the time Fakhar joined, The conflict was no longer about territorial lines alone, but about visions of existence, identity, and permanence in a region that seemed allergic to stability. Thus, the broader conflict was not a backdrop, but a forge, hammering men like Fakhar into hardened steel. Each Israeli incursion, each failed peace summit, each televised strike in Lebanon or Gaza was a blow shaping his destiny. He was not unique in being radicalized. He was unique in how far he was willing to take that radicalization, into the heart of international operations and the crosshairs of foreign intelligence services. The death of Fakhar Al-Basti cannot be disentangled from the competing positions of nations whose interests collided violently in the Middle East. Israel's stance was unambiguous. Hamas was not merely a political faction, but a terrorist organization committed to its destruction. From Tel Aviv's perspective, eliminating commanders like al-Basti was a matter of preemptive defense, not revenge. Mossad's doctrine of targeted assassination, honed since the days after Munich 1972, was openly whispered, yet never officially confirmed, giving Israel plausible deniability, while ensuring adversaries felt perpetual vulnerability. For Israel, men like Fakhar were not negotiators, but existential threats. Across the Arab world, positions diverged. Iran became Hamas's most consistent backer, providing funding, training, and logistical support. Tehran saw groups like Hamas as both ideological allies and useful proxies against Israeli and Western influence. Syria, under Hafez and later Bashar al-Assad, provided sanctuary for Hamas leaders, a safe haven where militants could plot operations while enjoying state protection. Qatar funneled money through both official and unofficial channels, cloaking support in the language of humanitarian relief while enabling Hamas's infrastructure to expand. Each of these states treated figures like Fakhar as both assets and symbols, proof that the struggle was still alive. Western powers, meanwhile, maintained a firm line. The United States and European Union designated Hamas as a terrorist group, cutting off formal avenues of support and pushing diplomatic recognition toward the Palestinian Authority instead. Yet even within Europe, contradictions surfaced. Some countries quietly tolerated Hamas operatives' presence, provided it remained discreet, while others turned a blind eye to fundraising networks established within their borders. Spain, where Fakhar would later die, was itself a paradox, officially aligned with EU counter-terrorism policy, yet often criticized for its leaky borders and soft surveillance, conditions ripe for covert operations by both militants and spies. This international tangle ensured that Fakhar's life could never remain confined to Gaza. Each trip abroad, each meeting in Damascus, Tehran, or Madrid, drew him deeper into a global web where he was alternately embraced, hunted, and exploited. His very existence became a mirror reflecting the positions of nations around him, nations that saw in him either a defender of the oppressed or a target marked for erasure. Fakhar al-Basti mattered not because he was the most famous Hamas leader, but because he operated in the liminal space between visibility and invisibility, where strategy and survival intertwined. He was a mid-level commander with outsized influence, responsible for logistics that kept operations alive beyond Gaza's borders. Unlike figureheads who delivered fiery speeches, Fakhar specialized in the unglamorous but essential: safe houses in Europe, money channels disguised as charities, forged documents that opened new frontiers for travel and supply. To dismantle his network was to choke the arteries of the organization. Intelligence services recognized this distinction. While bombastic leaders drew media attention, men like Fakhar represented the connective tissue holding militant infrastructures together. His ability to coordinate cells across 3 continents while leaving little trace marked him as uniquely dangerous. He was the type of figure whose disappearance would not generate headlines immediately, but would quietly cripple operations months later. For Mossad strategists, this was precisely the kind of adversary worth pursuing: low profile enough to catch unawares, critical enough to justify the resources of an elaborate hunt. For Hamas, Fakhar's value lay in his versatility. He could negotiate safe passage for operatives one day, arrange arms transfers the next, and still deliver speeches that reinforced ideological resolve in refugee camps. He carried both the credibility of a man who had grown up under occupation and the sophistication of someone who had learned to navigate international hotels and conference rooms without arousing suspicion. In a movement where martyrdom was often celebrated more than survival, Fakhar embodied a rarer archetype, the strategist who lived long enough to make survival itself a weapon. Thus, he mattered because he blurred categories. He was militant and bureaucrat, ideologue and pragmatist, invisible yet indispensable. His death in Marbella was not the loss of a symbol alone, but the disruption of a system. By targeting him, Mossad was not merely eliminating a commander, it was sending a message to Hamas and its backers that even the hidden architects of resistance, those who thrived in shadows, would be dragged into the light and erased. Fakhar al-Basti's entry into the world of clandestine violence began with small but consequential clashes that etched his name onto the watch lists of local authorities. In the early 1990s, during the turbulence that followed the First Intifada, he was implicated in organizing student protests that spiraled into stone-throwing riots. What appeared as youthful rebellion masked an emerging network of contacts that funneled supplies, tires, Molotov cocktails, crude explosives, into the hands of demonstrators. Israeli security services quickly identified him as a figure of interest, not because of his visibility but because he consistently appeared in proximity to unrest without being caught in the dragnet. His first arrest came in 1993 when he was intercepted at a Gaza checkpoint, carrying envelopes of cash, allegedly earmarked for underground cells. Official charges were vague, supporting hostile organizations, but his reputation inside the movement only grew. Prison time was brief, yet within those weeks he made contacts with hardened militants who schooled him in the mechanics of covert resistance. Upon release, he moved from peripheral activism into operational logistics, weaving a web that spanned Gaza, the West Bank, and eventually into Jordan. Each arrest record became less a deterrent and more a credential, proof that he was committed and unafraid. By the mid-1990s, al-Basti had been detained multiple times, accused of smuggling components for improvised explosives and facilitating the escape of wanted militants. Evidence was often circumstantial and legal proceedings muddled, but Israeli and Palestinian Authority intelligence both noted his growing influence. Where others crumbled under interrogation, Fakhar emerged calm, almost indifferent, projecting an aura of inevitability. These early confrontations with the law did not frighten him into retreat, but emboldened him to believe that destiny shielded his path. His trajectory from street organizer to militant operator was set, and the escalation had only begun. Prison hardened Fakhar al-Basti in ways that no battlefield could. He spoke later of nights spent under harsh lights, deprived of sleep and of interrogations designed less to extract information than to break spirit. Israeli detention facilities were notorious for psychological pressure, and Fakhar claimed he endured both physical blows and subtler tactics, endless questions, fabricated confessions from cellmates, and threats against his family. Whether all these accounts were true or embellished for legend, they became part of his mythology. What mattered was the effect. Rather than deter him, imprisonment deepened his conviction that resistance was righteous and inevitable. He emerged leaner, quieter, yet radiating a new intensity. To supporters, the scars of captivity became proof of authenticity, elevating him above men who only preached. He began to tell recruits that endurance in prison was the true test of faith, that bars and shackles were training grounds rather than punishments. In private, he wrote meticulous notes about interrogation techniques, vowing never to be caught off guard again. Prison was not a pause in his career but a crucible, reshaping him from restless activist into disciplined operator, who now viewed survival itself as an act of defiance. Upon his release, Fakhar al-Basti stepped directly into the swelling ranks of Hamas, a movement that had by then cemented itself as both political faction and militant force. He entered through its student wing, ostensibly organizing cultural events and study circles, but in reality using them as recruitment pools. His quiet demeanor and aura of resilience drew younger men toward him, and within months he was orchestrating cells that reported not just upward but sideways, maintaining compartmentalization to avoid exposure. Hamas valued him not for flamboyance, but for his ability to manage the invisible: funds, safe houses, couriers, and morale. By the late 1990s, Fakhar had shifted from participant to architect. He was credited with helping establish logistical networks that allowed weapons to move from Sinai tunnels into Gaza, often disguised as shipments of vegetables or spare parts. He became a founding member of a smaller operational subunit within Hamas's military wing, tasked with planning actions outside Gaza's borders. Though never the public face, his fingerprints were increasingly visible to intelligence analysts studying patterns of attacks and arrests. Each breadcrumb pointed to a man who operated behind layers of anonymity, the gray man, whose touch could be felt but rarely seen. What distinguished Fakhar during this phase was his pragmatism. Unlike commanders who demanded loyalty through fiery speeches alone, he coupled ideological certainty with efficiency. Meetings were timed with military precision, expenses documented in secret ledgers. Operatives rotated between duties to avoid burnout. These methods gave his units longevity and discipline, qualities that turned them into models replicated across Hamas. Some historians argue that Fakhar's bureaucratic rigor made him as dangerous as any battlefield commander because he gave chaos a structure. By embedding himself in both founding groups and their evolving branches, he ensured his influence stretched far beyond Gaza, reaching into Europe and the Middle East with quiet, methodical persistence. By the early 2000s, Fakhar Al-Basti had graduated from organizer to orchestrator, guiding operations that blurred the line between local resistance and transnational crime. Smuggling became his specialty. Using networks of Bedouin tribes in Sinai, he arranged the passage of weapons, rifles, explosives, and later advanced rocketry components, hidden among shipments of livestock or buried beneath sand, until safe extraction was possible. Intelligence reports suggested he supervised at least 3 major transfers in 2002 alone, each one feeding arsenals that fueled clashes inside Gaza. His genius lay not in brute force, but in precision. Routes mapped to avoid checkpoints, bribes calibrated to the exact weakness of each official, couriers rotated to prevent patterns. Kidnapping soon followed as a weapon of leverage. Fakhar oversaw abductions of rival collaborators and low-level informants, using them as bargaining chips or examples. Victims were often paraded in whispered rumors more than public spectacles, their fates becoming cautionary tales within Gaza's crowded alleys. Each disappearance amplified his reputation as a man who punished betrayal with surgical certainty. Some detainees reappeared broken but alive, while others simply vanished, their absence a louder warning than any execution could provide. Killings escalated as well. Fakhar authorized targeted strikes against rival factions, ensuring Hamas dominance during fragile ceasefire periods. His units ambushed convoys, planted roadside devices, and carried out nighttime raids that left opponents silenced before dawn. Though never accused of personally pulling the trigger, his role as mastermind was undeniable. It was during this period that Mossad analysts began filing thicker dossiers on him, recognizing his evolution from logistics man to lethal strategist. Fakhar was no longer just moving pieces on the board, he was reshaping the entire game, and the cost of ignoring him grew too high for his enemies. The chronology of Fakhar al-Basti's operations reads like a ledger of calculated defiance. In March 2001, intelligence linked him to a smuggling route that moved explosives through Rafah's tunnels, disguised in crates of citrus fruit bound for Gaza's markets. By November of the same year, Spanish authorities quietly flagged his arrival in Madrid under a forged Syrian passport, where he allegedly met financiers tied to shadow charities funneling money into Hamas coffers. Each movement was deliberate, each stop a node in a widening web. In July 2003, a kidnapping in Khan Yunis bore his signature. A suspected informant vanished, and 3 weeks later his family received only a sealed envelope with his confiscated ID card. The incident sent ripples through the camp, reinforcing the message that collaboration carried an invisible noose. In 2005, Fakhar's network orchestrated the movement of anti-tank missiles through Sudan, a transfer later traced by foreign intelligence, but never intercepted. His reputation was now continental. By 2007, following Hamas's takeover of Gaza, Fakhar shifted outward. A 2008 dossier in Jordan accused him of orchestrating a foiled bombing in Amman, though evidence was circumstantial. Later that year, French intelligence suspected him of meetings in Marseille, where arms brokers operated under the cover of maritime trade. Each of these incidents was like a flare in the night, briefly illuminating his position before he vanished again into darkness. For Mossad, these were not isolated crimes, but a pattern. A man who operated without boundaries, slipping between nations with the ease of a phantom. Each step forward made him harder to ignore, and each file added to his dossier brought him closer to being marked for elimination. By the late 2000s, Fakhar Al-Basti's name had shifted from whispered caution in alleyways to bold print on international intelligence bulletins. Israel's Shin Bet formally designated him a priority target in 2007, citing his role in financing and coordinating arms shipments that had strengthened Hamas's reach beyond Gaza. Soon after, Interpol received quiet alerts, coded in the bureaucratic language of suspected terrorist facilitator, though his photographs were rarely circulated publicly. Fakhar was valuable not for recognition, but for his anonymity, a paradox that made him both elusive and essential to neutralize. The United States added his name to a Treasury Department sanctions list in 2008, freezing any traceable assets and forbidding financial institutions from engaging with him. It was a symbolic move, since Fakhar preferred informal cash networks and hawala systems, but the designation signaled that Washington was watching. European services, particularly in France and Spain, began circulating internal memos noting his appearances in cities like Marseille, Madrid, and Barcelona, where he allegedly managed fundraising channels under the guise of cultural associations. Each sighting confirmed what intelligence already feared. Fakhar had transformed himself into a bridge between Middle Eastern militancy and European underworld logistics. Inside Hamas, his stature rose quietly. He was not the man in front of cameras, but the man who made sure operations abroad had money, weapons, and safe passage. Rivals both feared and respected his ability to navigate between political leaders, militant commanders, and foreign sponsors without losing credibility. This versatility earned him seats at secret strategy sessions and expanded his protection within the organization. Yet paradoxically, the higher his value rose inside Hamas, the brighter his profile burned in the eyes of those who hunted him. By 2009, Mossad dossiers on Fakhar swelled to hundreds of pages, detailing aliases, past flights, and suspected safe houses. Analysts circled his name in red ink during threat assessments, describing him as a structural pillar of Hamas abroad. That designation sealed his fate. When the machinery of targeted assassination begins grinding forward, it rarely halts. Fakhar had crossed the invisible line from nuisance to necessity, from shadowy operator to a man marked on the most wanted lists of nations with no patience for second chances. Once Fakhar Al-Basti's name landed on priority lists, attempts to end his life began in earnest. The first came in Damascus in early 2008, when a car bomb detonated 2 streets from his apartment. Officially, Syrian authorities blamed rival factions, but intelligence circles whispered of Mossad's hand, a warning shot that missed. Fakhar escaped unharmed, yet the incident forced him into deeper caution. He changed apartments monthly, rotated drivers, and never took the same route twice. His paranoia was not unfounded. The crosshairs had locked onto him. Later that same year, Jordanian security reported intercepting a poisoning plot. An operative posing as a visiting relative allegedly tried to deliver tainted food during a family gathering. The attempt failed, either by luck or suspicion, but the message was clear. His killers were studying his habits intimately. Fakhar grew more reclusive, shunning large gatherings and favoring hotel rooms over private homes, believing anonymity among strangers offered better odds than comfort among friends. By 2009, drone surveillance intensified over Gaza. Though Fakhar spent much of his time abroad, analysts tracked his rare visits home. On one such occasion, a drone strike leveled a safe house in Rafah minutes after he departed. Whether coincidence or precise intelligence, he considered it a miracle. Yet miracles were finite, and he knew it. His comrades began joking grimly that he had 9 lives, though each failed attempt only deepened the certainty that his eventual death would come not with warning, but with silence. Every close call reinforced his legend. Within Hamas, stories circulated of the commander who outwitted car bombs, poison, and drones. Supporters painted him as untouchable, while adversaries grew increasingly frustrated. In reality, these attempts chipped away at his confidence, eroding the illusion of invincibility. Fakhar sensed the inevitability, even admitted privately that no man marked this heavily could expect to die naturally. Yet he persisted, walking a razor's edge, balancing survival with the duties that kept him in the line of fire. By 2010, the inevitability of Fakhar Al-Basti's fate had settled like a shadow he could not outrun. He spoke less in meetings, his words weighted with the awareness that time was thinning. Even allies noticed the shift. Once meticulous and commanding, he now carried a haunted edge, checking mirrors twice, pausing at every doorway as if rehearsing for an end he already envisioned. The failed attempts that once bolstered his legend now felt like rehearsals for an execution still waiting for its perfect stage. In whispers, comrades admitted they no longer asked whether Fakhar would be killed, but when and how. The logic of the Shadow War was merciless. A man who touched so many networks, who threaded Gaza to Europe, could not be allowed longevity. Even he seemed resigned, remarking once, "Every hour alive is an hour stolen." Such fatalism marked the final act of his story, setting the stage for Marbella. It was not courage that kept him moving, but compulsion, the recognition that stepping back meant irrelevance, and irrelevance was worse than death. His death was no longer a question. It was a destination awaiting its coordinates, its date, and its cold, unflinching execution. The operation that would end Fakhar al-Basti's life began weeks before his arrival in Spain. Mossad's operatives, traveling under layers of false identities, slipped quietly into Europe aboard commercial flights that drew no suspicion. One landed in Madrid on Air France flight AF1308 from Paris. Another arrived in Barcelona via Alitalia flight AZ78, while a third entered through Lisbon, ensuring their entry points appeared scattered, unconnected. Each carried authentic-looking passports issued in the names of Canadians, Australians, and Germans, identities forged so well that even border control officers greeted them with casual indifference. From airports, they moved with the rhythm of tourists. Luggage carried swimsuits alongside encrypted communication gear, and cameras in their backpacks doubled as surveillance tools. One operative, posing as a travel blogger, even uploaded photographs of tapas restaurants to maintain a digital alibi. Another booked a guided tour of the Alhambra in Granada, a breadcrumb of normality carefully planted for investigators who might later retrace their steps. To the outside world, they were wanderers in Spain's endless sunshine. In reality, they were chess pieces converging toward a single square, Marbella. By the time Fakhar checked into Hotel Mirador, Mossad's advance team was already in place. They had mapped the hotel's exits, monitored the staff's routines, and studied the security cameras that dotted its halls. Operatives melted into the background, posing as honeymooners sipping wine on terraces, business consultants scrolling laptops in lobbies, and golf enthusiasts planning weekend excursions. Each alias was a mask, each movement choreographed to leave no trace of coordination. The hunters had arrived quietly, and the stage for their target's last performance was nearly set. The Mirador Hotel, with its marble floors and sea-facing balconies, became the silent theater where the hunters began their watch. Within hours of Fakhar al-Basti's check-in, 2 operatives had already registered under innocuous names: a middle-aged couple from Brussels in room 402, and a quiet businessman from Toronto in room 409. Both rooms flanked Fakhar's own room 406, offering vantage points from opposite ends of the corridor. Their luggage contained more than clothing: miniature fiber-optic cameras, lockpicks, and electronic devices disguised as chargers, all deployed under the guise of ordinary travel gear. The surveillance began subtly. The Brussels couple lingered at breakfast, noting the exact time Fakhar descended for his coffee and croissant. The businessman took nightly walks past the elevators, memorizing staff patterns and noting when cleaners unlocked doors. Meanwhile, another operative, registered at a separate hotel across the street, rented a suite overlooking the Mirador's pool, camera lens hidden in a flower pot, capturing the comings and goings of guests. Every movement of their target, every glance at the concierge desk, every late-night phone call, was observed, recorded, and transmitted in bursts of encrypted data to handlers far from Marbella. What made the surveillance unnerving was its perfection. No single operative shadowed Fakhar too closely. Instead, coverage overlapped like layers of a net. When Fakhar dined in the hotel restaurant, one operative sat 2 tables away, reading a newspaper upside down. When he stepped out to the promenade, another jogged past in running shoes, earbuds masking a whispering transmitter. Fakhar, ever cautious, sensed eyes but saw nothing unusual, only tourists, travelers, and strangers passing by. The surveillance was not brute force but choreography, each operative a dancer in a deadly ballet, circling closer as the final act approached. October 17, 2010, began like any other day in Marbella, sunlight spilling across the Mediterranean as tourists filled the promenade. For Fakhar Al-Basti, it started with routine. At 8:12 a.m., he left room 406 for breakfast. Black coffee, toast, and fruit, always taken at the same corner table. Unbeknownst to him, two operatives had already occupied positions nearby. One reading a business newspaper, another fiddling with a camera phone. His meal lasted exactly 18 minutes, a detail logged with precision. By 9 a.m., he was back in his room making calls on his encrypted device, unaware that his final hours had already entered countdown. Midday brought the next act. At 12:47 p.m., Fakhar walked to the marina, sunglasses shielding his face as he met briefly with a man believed to be a financial contact. The encounter lasted less than 15 minutes, but Mossad watchers captured every gesture from two separate vantage points. Back at the hotel, the Brussels couple used his absence to test electronic locks along the corridor, ensuring their modified keycards could override security systems. By 2:30 p.m., Fakhar returned to the Mirador, pausing briefly at the concierge desk before disappearing upstairs. The operatives tightened their surveillance net, waiting for night. Evening unfolded with eerie normality. At 7:05 p.m., Fakhar dined alone at the hotel restaurant, choosing lamb and rice, accompanied by mineral water. Across the room, the Toronto businessman pretended to draft emails, antenna hidden in his laptop, transmitting real-time updates. At 8:40 p.m., Fakhar lingered on the balcony of room 406, staring at the neon glow of Marbella's nightlife. Below him, one operative smoked a cigarette near the entrance, marking the target's presence with casual glances. By 10:15 p.m., the plan was locked. Two operatives positioned themselves inside room 402, another in 409, their equipment checked and signals tested. At 11:02 p.m., Fakhar switched off his television and prepared for bed. Outside his door, the hunters waited, silent and disciplined, the entire day's surveillance narrowing into a single hour of execution. The dance was over. The strike was about to begin. The method chosen for Fakhar Al-Basti's elimination reflected Mossad's preference for precision cloaked as accident. Operatives carried a compact kit disguised as toiletries. Inside, syringes thinner than sewing needles, a vial of paralytic agent derived from succinylcholine, and a device capable of reprogramming electronic keycards. The poison induced cardiac arrest within minutes, leaving few forensic clues. Its application required direct contact, delivered as a quick prick masked by the pressure of a pillow or the brush of a hand. For backup, they carried silenced pistols fitted with polymer components to evade metal detectors, though firearms were considered last resort. Electronic tools were equally vital. A laptop contained customized software to override the hotel's digital lock system, tested earlier when the Brussels couple roamed the corridor under guise of retrieving ice. Miniature fiber-optic cameras were slid beneath door frames, providing a live feed of Fakhar's movements within room 406. Communications relied on encrypted bursts through modified smartphones, each message designed to vanish seconds after transmission. Even their wristwatches held dual purposes. Outwardly ordinary, but capable of vibrating coded signals when silence was necessary. Disguise was another layer of the arsenal. Operatives carried changes of clothing, tourist attire, athletic wear, formal business suits, ready to shed one persona and adopt another within minutes. Each item had been chosen with foresight, ensuring no repeated appearances that could arouse suspicion from staff. The operation's elegance lay not in brute force, but in the symphony of tools. Chemicals, electronics, disguises, and rehearsed discipline, all converging into the illusion that Fakhar Al-Basti would die of natural causes, alone in a hotel room overlooking the Spanish Sea. The hours before midnight unfolded with a tension that could snap at the slightest misstep. At 11:23 p.m., A hotel guest unexpectedly lingered outside room 406, fumbling with a keycard to the wrong door. An operative, standing nearby with a drink in hand, improvised, offering directions with a friendly smile while concealing the urgency that pulsed beneath. Seconds stretched into minutes, and the mission teetered dangerously close to exposure. When the guest finally shuffled away, the silence in the corridor returned, heavy with relief. At 11:41 p.m., the cleaning staff began their rounds earlier than expected. A maid pushed her cart toward the target's hallway, humming softly, her key jangling as she prepared to unlock doors. Another operative, posing as a jet-lagged tourist, intercepted her casually, requesting extra towels and guiding her back toward the elevator. Her delay bought precious minutes, but it underscored the fragility of the operation. One misplaced gesture, one misheard name, and the illusion would collapse. Every glance, every creak of the hotel floor seemed amplified. Operatives exchanged the smallest nods, gestures rehearsed in training but now weighted with finality. Marbella's nightlife roared outside, yet within the Mirador's fourth floor, the air was thick with suspense, the hunters poised on the razor edge of exposure and success. At 11:58 p.m., the corridor of the fourth floor lay silent. Using a modified keycard, the lead operative slipped into room 406, the door closing with a muted click. Fakhar Al-Basti lay half asleep on the bed, television flickering faint blue across the room. Within seconds, the fiber-optic camera confirmed his position, and two agents entered, their movements precise, rehearsed. One pressed a pillow firmly against his face, muffling any sound, while the other delivered a nearly invisible injection to the side of his neck. The paralytic spread swiftly, tightening his muscles, arresting his breath. By 12:03 a.m., Fakhar was motionless, his body arranged to mimic natural slumber. Operatives adjusted the bedspread, returned the pillow to its place, and wiped down surfaces with gloved efficiency. His phone was left untouched, his belongings carefully undisturbed. The entire act had taken less than 7 minutes. When they departed, the corridor once again appeared ordinary, as if no one had passed. Outside, Marbella's nightlife continued, unaware that within the Mirador Hotel, a high-value target had just been erased with clinical finality. His death bore no gunshot, no explosion, only silence, staged as inevitability, hidden in plain sight. The following morning, October 18, 2010, the Mirador Hotel resumed its ordinary rhythm. Guests trickled into the breakfast hall, suitcases rolled across the polished lobby floor, and chambermaids began their rounds. At 10:27 a.m., one maid approached room 406, expecting to find it empty after checkout. Her knock went unanswered. With a master key, she entered, only to freeze in the doorway. Fakhar Al-Basti lay sprawled on the bed, eyes half open, face slack against the pillow. The scene bore no violence, no chaos, only the unsettling stillness of sudden death. Her screams drew hotel security within minutes. Radios crackled as staff locked the corridor, preventing guests from wandering too close. Local police arrived at 10:54 a.m., quickly photographing the room before draping sheets across the body. At first glance, the case appeared medical. Perhaps a heart attack, a stroke, or exhaustion from travel. Yet whispers began immediately. Why was a man traveling alone with multiple passports? Why did electronic logs show door activity inconsistent with his reported movements? Officers noted these irregularities but said little, wary of alarming the press. For now, the body was transported quietly to Marbella's Forensic Institute, while the hotel resumed its outward calm. The storm of suspicion was only beginning to gather. At 2:15 p.m., Fakhar Al-Basti's body arrived at Marbella's Forensic Institute, where Spanish pathologists began their examination under sterile lights. Initial impressions suggested sudden cardiac arrest, an explanation consistent with a man in his early 40s living under stress. Yet as the autopsy deepened, anomalies emerged. A faint puncture mark was discovered on the right side of his neck, so small it could easily have been dismissed as an insect bite. Toxicology screens later revealed traces of a neuromuscular blocking agent, rare in medical use, almost unheard of in Spain outside specialized laboratories. The heart showed no disease, the arteries bore no severe blockages. Instead, The pattern of muscular paralysis indicated external interference. The forensic team grew uneasy. They whispered of poisons engineered to leave few footprints, substances designed not for medicine but for covert elimination. The official report, cautious in its language, listed the cause of death as suspicious cardiac failure with possible toxicological involvement. Behind closed doors, however, investigators admitted the truth. This was no natural death. Someone had staged a medical crisis, weaponizing chemistry to mask murder. Word of the findings leaked within 48 hours, reaching journalists and intelligence services alike. Marbella, a city of beaches and golf courses, now stood at the epicenter of a covert killing whose implications stretched far beyond Spain's borders. When Spanish investigators pulled the Mirador Hotel's CCTV footage, the illusion of an ordinary death began to unravel. Cameras revealed a stream of foreign guests who appeared unremarkable, yet upon closer inspection, their movements aligned too perfectly. A man in a gray suit was captured circling the lobby 3 times within 15 minutes, glancing repeatedly at the elevators. A woman, registered as a Belgian tourist, lingered outside room 406 at 11:40 p.m., holding what appeared to be a keycard but never entering. Another figure, a supposed Canadian businessman, vanished from the hotel records the morning after Fakhar's death, leaving behind no forwarding information. Interpol soon joined the investigation, cross-referencing passport numbers used by these individuals. The scandal ignited when it became clear that several passports were genuine documents cloned from real citizens in Australia, Britain, and Germany. Each belonged to unsuspecting nationals whose identities had been stolen, sparking outrage when they discovered their names tied to an assassination plot splashed across global headlines. Governments demanded explanations, and suspicion quickly fell on Mossad, whose history of forging Western identities in covert operations was well documented. Diplomatic fallout was swift. Canberra, London, and Berlin summoned Israeli ambassadors, issuing formal protests and expelling diplomats in retaliation. Spain, embarrassed by the breach on its soil, launched a parliamentary inquiry into how a foreign intelligence team had maneuvered so freely through Marbella without detection. Newspapers branded the affair the passport war, running front-page spreads of blurred CCTV stills showing men and women who seemed both ordinary and spectral. Each image was a reminder of assassins hiding in plain sight. What emerged was not just evidence of Fakhar Al-Basti's targeted killing, but proof of a sophisticated operation that treated international borders as inconveniences rather than barriers. The scandal shifted the story from a local death into a global spectacle of espionage, revealing that beneath the Mediterranean sun, an invisible war had been fought and won in the shadows. The political shockwaves from Fakhar al-Basti's assassination spread faster than the investigation itself. Within days, Middle Eastern media branded it another chapter in Israel's campaign of targeted killings, while Hamas declared al-Basti a martyr whose blood proved that no sanctuary exists beyond Gaza. Iran and Syria seized the narrative, accusing Europe of complicity for allowing Mossad operatives to roam unchecked. Demonstrations erupted outside Spanish embassies in Beirut and Cairo, protesters waving placards that read, "Marbella or Gaza, everywhere is battlefield." European governments faced a dilemma. On one hand, they condemned the use of forged passports and the violation of Spanish sovereignty. On the other, many quietly acknowledged that Israel's actions aligned with their own fears of Hamas's growing reach across the continent. Publicly, they expelled diplomats and demanded assurances. Privately, intelligence services pored over the operation with a mixture of frustration and admiration, dissecting Mossad's methods to gauge both vulnerabilities and possibilities. For Israel, the fallout was familiar. Official spokesmen issued bland denials, neither confirming nor denying involvement, while senior officials hinted that those who sponsor terror cannot hide forever. Within Mossad, the operation was catalogued as both success and cautionary tale, the target eliminated, yet the political noise louder than anticipated. In Spain, the scandal left scars on national pride, reinforcing its reputation as a soft underbelly of European security. The assassination had achieved more than silencing a single commander. It had reignited debates about the legitimacy of targeted killings, about the ethics of shadow wars waged across neutral soil. To some, al-Basti's death was justice delivered. To others, it was a dangerous precedent, proof that international law falters when confronted by states wielding assassins as instruments of policy. The global fallout ensured that the man who died silently in room 406 echoed noisily across parliaments and chancelleries worldwide. Behind Fakhar al-Basti's death lay not only agents in corridors but entire bureaucracies, humming in fluorescent-lit offices, far from Marbella's coastline. Mossad itself was but the sharpest edge of a sprawling machine. Intelligence committees, interministerial desks, and budgetary approvals hidden in plain view. Assassinations do not spring from improvisation. They are birthed from layers of paperwork, coded authorizations, and signatures that appear mundane, yet carry the weight of life and death. These agencies operate like shadow empires, their emblems never stamped in public, their memos written to be burned or forgotten. Each file passed through this machine stripped Fakhar of humanity, reducing him to a designation, target of operational necessity. Analysts compiled binders, lawyers drafted justifications, ministers offered nods behind closed doors. Every detail, from the poison selected to the fake passports printed, was the result of committees that thrived in anonymity. For those inside, the process was antiseptic, an exercise in management rather than morality. The operatives who carried syringes and keycards were only the final instruments. The real architecture was invisible, built by clerks, planners, and supervisors who never stepped into the field. This phantom bureaucracy gave assassinations their eerie foundation. It proved that espionage was not merely the art of shadows, but also the craft of administration, where forms and files became as lethal as bullets. Fakhar's death was less a spontaneous strike than a bureaucratic inevitability, a decision made long before he lay in room 406, executed by legions whose names will never surface. If the phantom bureaucracy was the brain, then the invisible legions were the hands, elite operatives drawn from the ranks of Israel's most secretive units. Some came from Sayeret Matkal, masters of reconnaissance and infiltration. Others had backgrounds in Kidon, Mossad's assassination wing, a cadre whispered about even within intelligence circles. Each was molded into archetypes: the mimic, able to adopt any accent; the ghost, expert in locks and silent entry; the artisan, skilled in poisons and chemistry. To outsiders, they were myths. To insiders, they were necessary tools sharpened for missions like Marbella. These legions operated without uniforms, medals, or recognition. Their lives were an endless sequence of cover stories, honeymooners, consultants, retirees, that allowed them to drift unseen through airports and hotels. They trained for years to erase hesitation, to act decisively in compressed windows of opportunity. Within Mossad lore, their discipline was described as silence with teeth. In Marbella, they proved the description true, moving like shadows cast under bright lights, visible to everyone yet noticed by no one. To imagine Fakhar al-Basti's death as the work of 2 or 3 assassins is to miss the scale of the machinery. The invisible legions ensured not only his silence, but the mythic aura that lingers over every Mossad operation. The Marbella operation carried echoes of older missions, ghostly fingerprints left across decades of clandestine warfare. In 1960, operatives tracked down Adolf Eichmann in Buenos Aires, abducting him in silence before spiriting him to trial in Israel. In 1973, the Lillehammer affair in Norway revealed the peril of mistakes when a Moroccan waiter was wrongly executed, teaching Mossad the high cost of miscalculation. These stories lingered in briefing rooms, cautionary parables whispered to new recruits. Precision was survival. Error was exposure. More recent missions provided fresher echoes. In 1995, Mahmoud al-Mabhouh, another Hamas commander, was found dead in a Dubai hotel, suffocated with poison and staged as a natural death. The Marbella strike mirrored that blueprint almost exactly, refining it with new technology and subtler disguises. Each mission, like a brushstroke, contributed to the noir canvas of espionage, staged accidents, forged passports, CCTV trails that later unraveled into international scandals. For the operatives in Marbella, these echoes were not history lessons but living reminders. They carried the weight of past triumphs and failures, ghosts at their shoulders guiding every gesture, every glance. When they pressed the pillow and injected the poison into Fakhar al-Basti, They were not only executing a man but performing a ritual passed down through the shadow tradition of assassination. The old missions lived again that night, leaving their unfinished resonance within the silent room of the Mirador Hotel. Above the operatives, beyond the bureaucracy, sat the architects, the gods behind the curtain. These were cabinet ministers, intelligence chiefs, and prime ministers who authorized death with nods disguised as strategy. They were not flawless visionaries but flawed puppeteers, juggling politics, fear, and vengeance. To them, Fakhar Al-Basti was not a man, but a calculation, a risk removed with surgical precision. Their signatures set shadows into motion, their denials written before the first operative boarded a plane. In the end, they remained hidden, basking in plausible deniability, while others carried the weight of their choices in silence. Fakhar al-Basti's body was flown quietly from Spain to Gaza under heavy mourning. His funeral, held on October 23, 2010, transformed narrow camp streets into rivers of grief and defiance. Thousands filled Shati's alleys, carrying banners, chanting resistance slogans, and hoisting his portrait above the crowd like a relic. Women wept from balconies, children ran alongside the procession, and masked men fired rifles into the air, each shot a punctuation mark in the language of vengeance. His coffin, draped in green, was paraded past the very camp where he had grown up, a full-circle journey from childhood poverty to martyrdom. The immediate political impact was just as forceful. Hamas leaders seized the moment, portraying al-Basti not as a victim, but as a hero whose reach had extended into Europe itself. They declared his assassination proof of Israel's desperation, promising retaliation that would echo across borders. For the community, his death was less about an individual and more about collective symbolism, proof that even far from Gaza, their struggle followed them, and that the enemy's hand was tireless. Spain's name was barely mentioned. Marbella had simply become another battlefield etched onto the movement's memory. In the months following Fakhar al-Basti's assassination, the power vacuum he left behind became starkly evident. His networks of finance, logistics, and safe houses did not collapse immediately, but began to fray without his meticulous oversight. Funds stalled in transit, operatives quarreled over leadership, and rival factions seized opportunities to assert control. Within Hamas, new figures rose quickly, yet none matched Fakhar's balance of discipline and adaptability. His absence forced the organization to rely more heavily on external sponsors like Iran and Qatar, tightening dependencies that carried both strength and risk. For Israel, his death was tallied as a strategic success, another silent mark on Mossad's long ledger. Yet it also reaffirmed a cycle. Each eliminated commander became a martyr, each martyr fueling fresh recruits eager to take up arms. Analysts noted that while Fakhar's networks were disrupted, they were not destroyed. Instead, they evolved, shifting to new handlers, adapting to new pressures. The assassination had bought time, not resolution. Globally, the Marbella strike entrenched the image of Mossad as relentless and borderless. It sent chills through other operatives who lived under assumed names abroad, reminding them that Europe's hotel corridors were no safer than Gaza's alleys. Fakhar's death reverberated not as an end, but as a continuation of the shadow war. In the end, Fakhar al-Basti's death changed little in the grand scheme of geopolitics. The conflict endured, new commanders rose, and the machinery of resistance and reprisal ground on without pause. Yet what his assassination revealed was a hidden world, one where government-sanctioned killers, where hotel rooms became battlegrounds, and where truth remained buried in silence. Marbella's sunlit coast, remembered by tourists for leisure, became etched in history as a stage for shadows. Fakhar's final lesson was chillingly clear. In the realm of espionage, survival is temporary, death is deliberate, and justice is a language spoken only in whispers.